Hello, Dragon Slayers. Good morning. We're joined today by Jessica Ferron and CJ, and both of them have shared with me an interest in science fiction and in ethics. Jess is joining me in attempting to put together a book that synthesizes our knowledge of neurotheology with optimal human functioning. But this time we're going to be supporting this book, Dragon Slaying, a book about heroic transformation that made it to the Amazon bestseller list. And in addition, should you wish to sponsor this, you can send us an email at drtom.author@gmail.com. Let's talk about universal laws. And we're going to look at the interface of laws in science fiction and fantasy, those of Tolkien, Asimov, Gene Roddenberry, Leonard Nimoy. And we'll start with the 7 noetic laws. The 7 noetic laws were the laws that anchored mankind at the time following the Great Flood. And it was agreement between God and man to abide by 7 laws. And the 7 laws addressed idolatry, honesty, theft, avoiding homicide, and others that derive from it. But ultimately, there was a law that mankind should have laws that govern them. The noetic laws have ultimately interfaced with both Asimov's laws, Roddenberry's laws, obviously Leonard Nimoy's laws, as well as the laws of Tolkien. And what each of these laws hold in common is rules of honesty, rules respecting life, rules in addition that talk about if you confront a new culture, you need to have a respect for those cultural norms. Hence, all of the efforts on the part of the various Star Trek crews not to intervene unnecessarily in another culture. And that, by the way, are the laws that we were taught as cultural anthropologists. We take a culture as we find it, and we attempt to modify it as little as possible as a consequence of our study. Jess, CJ, offer some comment here.
So, Dr. Tom and I have been talking about this topic for a little while now. And the reason that I am so interested in this is I have a minor in religious studies, just basically theology. And I wrote my undergraduate senior thesis on essentially apocalyptic themes in film and how there is a departure from using church and religion to get our sense of community and ritual from. But there is a huge increase in people who find culture and meaning in science fiction and fantasy. And you can see that there are a lot of resources online if anybody is interested to go look into more of this information. But I find it fascinating that we are telling very similar stories over and over again in different cultures. And even if someone departs and says that they're not religious, they're an atheist, they still pick up moral codes, and often they're from the books that they read. There are Brandon Sanderson has the Mistborn series and the Stormlight Archives. And if you go online on Reddit, there are people who have built their whole moral code around Brandon Sanderson's work. And then you have the Jedi religion, which came out of Star Wars and is now an actual religion that people can join and be a member of, and it is recognized by some government entities, probably not all, I haven't verified that, but a few of them. So I wanted to talk to Dr. Tom, what are the benefits of that and what are the drawbacks? And I wanted to start with something like the Jedi religion that pretty much everybody has heard of. Everybody knows what a Jedi is that has access to the technology to listen or watch this podcast. So I think it's a pretty safe, neutral base to start. But I thought that I would ask CJ, because CJ is as close as I know to someone who would actually join the Jedi religion. And I wanted to talk through what the Jedi religion is now that it exists outside of the Star Wars chronology and books and movies and all of that. And I wanted to talk to Dr. Tom about, is this a good thing to replace people who maybe weren't raised religiously, or people who have rejected religion for traumatic, ethical, or whatever reasons? So CJ, will you talk to us a little bit about what the Jedi religion is?
Well, you guys are the resource of wisdom here. So, but what our audience may not know is that CJ has studied martial arts for years, and I am curious as you look at the laws of the Jedi Knights, how that interfaces the laws as you know it as a martial artist.
So, not to derail us with my unnecessary backstory here, but I guess it's related since Dr. Tom brought that up. I'm actually in martial arts because of Star Wars. So I was obsessed with Star Wars as a kid, and then stumbled across stories about Shaolin monks with supernatural abilities through mastering their chi, right? And read about it as if it were a real thing, and was like, "Oh, Jedi are real! I can do that!" And thus my martial arts journey began, right? And lo and behold, George Lucas expressed in interviews that the inspiration for the Jedi religion was actually Shaolin monks and Zen Buddhism, and some of the tenets and expressions of those religions in the real world set kind of the groundwork for what the Jedi were going to be, and then the aesthetic of the Jedi were modified for this science fiction universe. And so there are absolutely parallels between like tenets of the Jedi religion and what we tend to associate with the martial arts, things like a dedication to self-mastery, giving up worldly pleasures in pursuit of that self-perfection, a certain sort of asceticism. There are definitely elements in the martial arts of obviously use your skills for self-defense and not to arbitrarily cause harm, but a willingness to cause harm in order to prevent harm being caused to others, right? Like, don't hurt people, but if they're bad guys, you can hurt them to stop them from being bad guys. That's a concept that's expressed in line with the self-defense morality in martial arts, and it's an explicit tenet of the Jedi Order that they're peacekeepers, right? They don't seek to do harm, but they will do harm to prevent further harm from being done if they have no other choice. And so there's a direct one-to-one parallel between what's taught in a lot of martial arts schools and then that tenet of the Jedi Order.
So before we get too far, I want to just shout out that your mom. I want to shout out that your mom, and to anybody who doesn't know, CJ and I recently got married, and Dr. Tom was our officiant. So CJ's mom is my superhero. So his mom had a young boy who was not being raised in a specific religious tradition of any kind, and he was obsessed with Star Wars, and she said, "I need to get this kid interested in anything other than Star Wars." And so she drove him from Carson City to Reno, which was about an hour-long drive at the time, twice a week to take him to the specific type of Kung Fu that he wanted to go to. Twice a week from Carson, an hour back and forth, so 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday or whatever it was, to help him find something other than Star Wars. And it sort of backfired because it just made him actually become someone who practices the Jedi faith. Not really. CJ doesn't go around saying I'm a Jedi and telling people that. But he picked up the principles and became a black belt in that specific tradition. But his mom saw an opportunity and took it. And her kid, who was very stuck on one thing, then picked up martial arts as a side gig that, blossomed into something else. So I just thought, for parents, if your kid is struggling to have a moral framework and you're not sure what to raise them in, sometimes they're not wrong. Sometimes if they're really interested in Tolkien, that's their moral framework and you can roll with it and it will work out.
And actually, riffing on that, so I was super into Star Wars, and then I discovered a connection between what the Jedi were like, as a fifth grader, right? In terms of like the Force powers and the parts that I found exciting, I found a connection between that and martial arts. And so I pivoted to martial arts and became obsessed with that. And then by continuing this interest in, again, originally like chi powers, right? Like I wanted to be a Jedi. Well, in pursuing those aspects of the martial arts, I inevitably stumbled across Taoism and Zen Buddhism and these sort of philosophical or religious practices that tend to overlap with the martial arts historically. And instantly my interest in that was piqued. And I've actually retained an incredible interest in things like Zen meditation and in kind of metaphysics generally, but especially metaphysics of Eastern religions from that point forward. And that's formed a foundation for me morally and spiritually, and definitely given my life a religious context that I don't think it would have had otherwise. I didn't attend church growing up. I wasn't raised in a religious household, as Jess pointed out. But I had this incredibly religious grounding as a result of discovering the teachings of like Zen Buddhism and Taoism as a result of Star Wars and then the martial arts and then all of these kind of adjacent relationships.
I do want to bring us back though, because my original question for Dr. Tom with this topic is, let's just say someone doesn't find another Taoism and Buddhism and another source. What do you think of people who have chosen the Jedi Temple as their foundation? That's what they attach to.
Let me pull a few things together because I'm sitting on several remarks. One is,
I can see it in your face.
one of this is that an outcome of the story you just said very likely is a closer bond to your mother. That is, a realization that she was investing so much energy in something that was your interest is truly self-sacrificing.
Mm-hmm.
And then let me pull this together with stuff I talked about last week and a recent experience. We know each other by our discipline codes. That is, if we know we share a code and we can recognize this, we virtually become brothers and sisters. Last week I talked about the death of an old friend, and the man that died happened to be a physician. And I was at the celebration of life service, and I realized what a strong brotherhood we have if we're physicians, because physicians themselves have their own disciplines and orders. You know, at the completion of the conferring of an MD degree on a physician, we recite the Hippocratic Oath that has stayed with us for centuries. So I would say these disciplines order us in a way that make culture work. And in fact, I think I had a great idea for a book, Jess, and that is Discipline is Not a Four-Letter Word.
I like that.
Which really gets to the notion that it can inspire us, it can give us direction, get us closer to God, and that's what binds us together. So there is merit in Asimov's laws of robots. Incidentally, those laws of robots were recently expanded by Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, when he talked about his laws of artificial intelligence, which is very much a spin-off of the laws of robots.
So, for anybody who doesn't know, I have those laws pulled up, and I thought that I would read them off because I realize you have to be pretty deep into either technology or sci-fi to know what the laws of robotics are. So I'll briefly summarize them. The first one is a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. And Asimov wrote these in 1942 originally. So I think that it's really interesting that something that was written before robotics was actually a discipline is a foundation for robotics now. And I wanted to bring that up specifically, Doc, with the context of AI now that is coming forth. And now we actually do have robots that people could purchase and use and that are being applied in many different spaces. Should we be following Asimov's 3 laws, or is that an arbitrary source? He's just a science fiction author. Why him?
Well, absent anything else, I think we follow the laws. Let me extend this further. A bit of trivia. What character was most essential to Star Trek?
Which Star Trek?
I feel like there's only one good answer here.
What's the answer?
Dr. Spock.
And why is that?
Because he was oh man, I feel like I should probably at this point just confess that I'm a hardcore Star Trek fan. And my mom and I quote Dr. Spock on a regular basis. He was a moral framework because he was half human, half Vulcan, and he was a foil for the other characters because he experienced human emotion, but he suppressed them, and he utilized science as his moral framework often. So he was the most important because he moved, he was the smartest character and he moved the plot forward, and everybody would have died without him just so many times. But also he was often ironically, the therapist of the group, where he allowed for reflection from the other characters of what was really happening and how they were feeling, because he didn't treat emotion as an experience that you peek and follow. He watched emotion and then commented on it from the outside.
So I would offer this, that I know a few things about the history of Star Trek, and most of that is I've had an opportunity to meet and talk to Leonard Nimoy before his death.
Oh, that's so cool.
And he's an amazing guy, was an amazing guy. But I would say that Roddenberry's genius was to choose him for the character of Spock, because his charisma held that series together. And he was the anchor and the moral compass of Star Trek. And he also had the agonies of being part Vulcan and part human. But Spock himself took his Vulcan ideology from the Talmud. Leonard Nimoy was an Orthodox Jew, and even the Vulcan salute, if you can see it on camera, was a blessing that was taken from Judaism. And he was deeply anchored in Jewish mysticism, including the feminine aspects of God. So, a brilliant guy, and obviously a cultural icon, which probably shaped your generation as much as mine.
Oh, absolutely.
I got back, I had returned from the Peace Corps, and I had never had a color TV before, or never had a TV really to speak of. And I was in my residency, and we made it a point. We didn't have recordings, as I recall. We just simply made it a point to watch Star Trek in the evenings when it came on. I mean, it's kind of a religious ritual. Because of my generation, it really shaped it as well. Now, going forward, if we're looking at Star Trek, if we look at Tolkien, if we look at any great piece of fiction or any epic, they all need to follow rules. And the rules are what govern a culture and govern a society. If we didn't have rules in science fiction, it'd be chaotic. So it's the tension against the rules that develops the hero. The hero both must pursue whatever the hero or heroine needs to accomplish in the myth, but also must abide by the rules, stay within the rules. And it's often that tension of achieving your mission and being within the rules that make the experience emotionally rewarding, intense. Quick story. Yesterday, I had the good fortune of meeting a gentleman I never met before. The meeting was arranged by the fellow that assisted me in our first book, Dragon Slaying, Dr. Anthony Zarnick. And I was introduced to his brother, Jim Zarnick. And to be introduced to his brother was almost like being introduced to a blood brother. The similarities between us between Jim and me were what caused Tony to set up the meeting. And both of us were hyper disciplined. Both of us were former athletes, and both of us were physicians. And Jim had taken the path of, first of all, being a paratrooper, Army Ranger, and then morphing into a physician that took care of paratroopers and ultimately ascended to the point that he was responsible for NATO's healthcare efforts. But really a brilliant and compassionate guy. And when I greeted him, he said, "You, in effect, I greet everyone with hugs." And I said, "Well, that's cool." And we both greeted and parted with hugs, but the connection was almost synchronous. It was like magic. It was like, wow, there's so many similarities between us. And Tony even remarked on that. We had both spent time in West Africa and so on. So the point of this, going full circle, is that we were both beholden to a discipline, the same discipline, in the sense that we wanted to be complete physicians, that our physicianhood was anchored not in a pursuit of monetary gain, but was anchored deeply in the ethic of physicians. That is, to skillfully provide compassionate care to our patients. And we were unique in that regard, that we were kind of old school. But I think that's true of disciplines that occur in fiction, whether you be in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or if you're looking at Star Trek, or you're looking at Foundation, or anything that follows, and things. And I think one of the things that is true of fictional explorations is that on occasion we confront fiction that is offensive to our own moral compass. And what comes to mind are, I would say science fiction of the sort that The Hunger Games or RoboCop or some dystopian fantasy that is anchored in cruelty. One of the problems I had in watching, the series, the fantasy series that involved a fantasy kingdom, brutal, ruthless killings in it.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I lost it, when the first episode, when they threw the kid off a balcony to his death. So,
Well, he didn't die, which, if anybody didn't know that, it got worse for him.
But he didn't die.
Yeah.
I should have seen episode 2, whatever it was.
I don't know if you would have lasted if that got you. I think the rest of the series would have put you off as well.
But that's personal taste. I like my.
So actually, not to cut you off, Doc, but to kind of, this is something I was hoping we would get to when Jess told me what the premise of this podcast was. And you kind of just ran 2 laps around it and then hit it on the head. So I kind of want to highlight it, is that I think an issue that is explored in some of those darker, more dystopian fantasy and sci-fi stories, and that's worth discussing here, is that some of those dystopian storylines are trying to shine a light on an aspect of something that's gone wrong, right? In the case of Game of Thrones, right, a big aspect of the story is abuse of power and the pursuit of power for its own sake and how that goes bad. And so I agree with you that, discipline and moral frameworks are important, but one of the drawbacks that I see in them, both in science fiction and fantasy and in the real world, is that they aren't a good unto themselves, right? I like thinking of personal discipline not as a restriction or a burden, but as my favorite quote is, discipline means not letting what you want right now get in the way of what you truly want, right? It guides us towards long-term thinking and personal investment instead of succumbing to our impulses, right? But the reason that's a good thing is because we will attain greater reward and more personal fulfillment, more happiness by investing in ourselves and having delayed gratification than we will be just by satisfying our impulses in the moment, right? The reason why the noetic laws that you mentioned were of value is not because laws in and of themselves are good, but because there is something valuable that we want to safeguard. And in order to safeguard it, these are some things that we should avoid doing in order to keep it safe. Or in the case of the Jedi religion, going back to our original theme, right? The Jedi code includes things like, there is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. And so it's the same kind of admonition against impulsivity, admonition against knee-jerk reactions, and this sense of condoning mindfulness of something that's bigger and better. But it requires patience and mindfulness and discipline in order to remain connected to that thing, in order to safeguard that thing. I think the drawback that we run into sometimes when we become obsessed with laws and with discipline is we forget that they exist for a reason and they aren't the reason, right? They're a means to an end, they aren't the end. And I think a lot of dystopian fiction, fantasy, and sci-fi is usually based around when that's forgotten, right? Especially things like, techno-fascism, those kinds of themes you'll see is usually, at least in the case of a corrupt government, is because they're obsessed with law and order for its own sake. Like, law and order is good. And they don't say, like, what it is they're protecting or why it's good. It just is good. And then enforcing laws, whether they're accomplishing something good or not, becomes the point of that government, and they end up doing more harm than good. And so I think not just having rules against things, but having teachings around what you are trying to accomplish with those rules is really, really important. Otherwise, the rules themselves can become toxic.
In fairness to the creators of Game of Thrones, I do get it that the story of the Game of Thrones is the tension between the benevolent, if you will, the God-seeking, the moral, against this dystopian background. So I do understand that. I do think that.
Well, I don't know if that stayed true the whole series. I think at some point it became violence and power for violence and power entertainment's sake. But it would be nice if that was how that story went.
Well, I'm hoping that would be the case. At least it would make more sense to me. But then we'll go back to the myth of the Princess Bride. How's that?
That one's hard to argue with.
Much more wholesome.
Yes.
Okay. But I think the idea is that these stories are governed by discipline that provide the structure. But that's true of even film noir. Film noir has its own rules. The prototypical characters in film noir is the incorruptible detective, the evil force, if you will, the dark princess that distracts the indestructible character, and then the prize. And I think, one of the reasons I think that Bogart was most successful in film noir is he captured all of that ambiguity in one character. But going on. So, how does this shape our children? And what becomes to our children? You were a child of this, as they are shaped by these mythical structures, Star Wars, Tolkien, and so on.
There was a study that I did not fully read, but that I had reference to, that said that people who were raised with Harry Potter, that read the books and were interested in the movies, were more likely to grow up into being compassionate adults. And regardless of your current feelings of Harry Potter, or if anybody's interested or not interested, I thought it was really interesting that that was such a cultural movement, and that people pulled so much out of it. It became a moral framework. There were a lot of people who, they really do believe they belong to the house. They believe that personality sort test will determine some factor in their life that's important, and their compatibility with other people. It's a reference for their experiences. But I think that it's true of a lot of these things. People who were very interested in Star Trek grew up to be more patient, more compassionate people. And you can see from Star Trek, if anybody doesn't know, I believe Star Trek was the first instance of having a main character that was a consistent Black woman. And people who grew up watching Star Trek, you can attest, there are a lot of different colored people on that show, but not all of them are aliens. Sometimes they're just people who are Asian or whatever, and it created a more tolerant space for understanding people who are of different cultures. And I think growing up with fantasy, it depends on your fantasy, I haven't read all of them, you understand that there are different roles for different people, and all people have some form of value. If you grow up just reading books about, I don't know, people who all look the same and act the same, it builds a very rigid moral framework of what is right and wrong. But when you look at things that are more diverse, then it builds up your tolerances and your expectations that other people will have different opinions, and they might be right also. They might also act differently, and that doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just a different way of doing the same thing.
I like it. Good. It works. Okay. What other things would you like to cover today?
Those were my only topics, is I wanted to cover those and see what you thought. And it sounds like where we landed was, if you're gleaning a moral framework that isn't from a traditional religion, you're pulling it from your favorite fantasy novel. The important part is that you don't shy away from the hard parts of what you're holding up as your moral fantasy. You can't just be a sword fighter because you like Aragorn from the Fellowship. That's not your moral framework. Your moral framework is all of the other aspects of that world that you look to, and that it's still a reference point for your own morals. You still have to look objectively, and you have to glean truth, but you also have to glean criticism from how those characters react in each scenario.
Let me tell you a story of my department chairman in anthropology at Stanford. He's a wonderful guy. His name was George Spindler. And George tells this story of when he was a graduate student. He studied with the Menominee tribe, and he was very deeply into the tribe and the tribal rules. And he'd been at this for perhaps almost a year. And every anthropologist that works with tribes knows that they ultimately have to have a cultural informant. Somebody, when the tribe invites the anthropologist in, they know that the informant will keep guardrails on the anthropologist so that the anthropologist doesn't violate some cultural code. Well, while studying with the informant for almost a year, George went to sleep one night and he had a dream. And the dream was that 12 Indian braves were dancing on the tent pole above him. And he confided to his informant that he had this dream, all within the myth of the Menominee. And the informant immediately left George's tent and came back with the tribal elders, the chief and the medicine people and so on. And at that point, George was initiated into the Menominee tribe because he had a tribally programmed mythical dream that meant that he was prepared to be a brave. So what I'm speaking here is the power of these various myths to shape us in the direction that the culture wants of us to become contributing human beings. So there.
I think that's a great story.
Yes. Okay. Well, for those of you out there, I hope you read science fiction from a new perspective and read the good stuff. By the way, as Star Wars aficionados, which version of Star Wars do you prefer?
I'm not answering that. I would like to stay married.
Pre-Disney.
Oh, but Andor. So
What you say?
Yeah, Andor, which was not written by the usual Disney writers. Huge shout out, by the way, anyone remotely interested in being anti-dystopian, I guess, to keep it as general as possible. Andor is the single greatest Star Wars television show that I've ever watched. So go watch Andor. Shameless plug. But yeah, I do find that there's a lot more richness and value in what we now call Star Wars Legends. It used to be called the Expanded Universe, was a series of books and developments that went above and beyond the films that all various kinds of authors put together.
I think
Grew up
Dr.
loving
Tom,
that stuff,
I think
so
he
that's what I
meant
recommend.
The original trilogy.
Do you have any recommendations for contemporary readers? The kinds of things that you would want Ren to read, for example, your son.
Oh man, we'd be happy if he read anything at all. That would be good for us.
I will recommend for folks, there is a very long series that many different authors contributed to called the New Jedi Order series. It's set like not quite 30 years after the end of Return of the Jedi in Star Wars timeline. Incredibly well-written books with completely brand new kind of enemy that they all have to face, and explores the next generation of characters in Star Wars. Examples from that series would have made really good examples for the topic of this podcast. So if you're out there looking for something related that you think you might enjoy, I can't recommend that one enough.
Okay, and also a special shout out to you, CJ. This podcast would not have happened had CJ not rescued my previously defective computer. So thank you both. And
podcast and Star Wars and moral and ethical philosophy as expressed through science fiction, brought to you by huge nerds.
and then Jess, you and I have some writing projects I'm sure we have to get on with.
We do.
Okay. Well, for those of you out there, I wish you a good week. We are about to head into autumn and all sorts of adventures following that. I am not going to be podcasting for about a week because I'm going to have a little minor surgery, but I'll catch you guys in about 2 weeks. Anyway, to all of you, be well and keep the faith. And if you can, read Dragon Slaying. Later. Bye.